The wind swept across the wide prairie like a living thing, carrying with it the smell of dust, the faint sweetness of hay, and the unspoken whispers of a woman's broken dignity. Her name was Clara May, and if you had seen her only a week ago, you might have mistaken her for any other young widow on the edge of town. Quiet, graceful, soft-spoken, still wrapped in the heavy grief of a husband buried too soon. But today she sat on the hard dirt floor outside her late husband's family home, her body trembling, her head bare and raw beneath the noonday sun. The hair that once fell in dark, heavy braids was gone, shaved off by the merciless hands of her own in-laws, who stood on the porch and sneered at the sight of her. They had done it in anger, but more so in cruelty, claiming that her sorrow was a disguise, that her beauty had brought nothing but shame, that she was a curse on the Weston name. When the clumps of her hair had fallen to the ground, Clara had felt as though her very soul had been shorn with it, leaving her naked before the world, exposed in a way she could never hide. She wanted to scream, to fight, to claw back the pieces of herself that had been taken, but her voice had caught in her throat, and so she simply lowered her eyes, letting the dust sting her bare scalp, trying to pretend she no longer existed. "You've got no place here," her brother-in-law had hissed at her, his shadow long and cruel against the dirt. "Take your shame and go. You were never truly one of us." Life on the ranch did not soften overnight. It was as hard and unyielding as the land itself. But Clara found herself learning to breathe, again in the quiet stretches of dawn and dusk. The rancher, Elias McGraw, kept his word after he found her half-broken in the dust outside her in-laws' homestead. He had looked at her shaved head, her tear-stained face, and the way she curled her arms around herself like a child who had been whipped too, many times, and without hesitation he had said the words that kept replaying in her mind. "You're coming with me." At first she had resisted, her pride still trying to stand on shaky legs, but he had simply guided her to his horse, lifted her up with the strength of a man who had lived too many years, under open skies, and carried her away from the house of her torment. Now, days later, she woke to the sound of roosters crowing and cattle lowing, the smell of strong coffee drifting from the small ranch house, and the creak of wood as Elias moved about, already half a day into his labor before she could rise. She hated that she felt both gratitude and shame every time she touched her bald head, her fingers brushing over the bristles that were only now beginning to show as soft stubble. She wore a borrowed dress from Elias's late sister, the fabric loose and faded, and though she tried to keep her head bowed so no one in town would see, Elias never once let his gaze linger on her with pity. Instead, he treated her as if she were whole, as if the shaving of her head and the cruelty she endured had not stolen her worth. That confused her more than anything else. A man who should have left her to her fate, a man who owed her nothing, chose instead to give her a roof, food, and safety. And worse, each passing day, she could feel her heart just daring to beat differently, when his voice carried across the yard, or when his calloused hands brushed hers while passing her a tin cup of water. But love was dangerous, and she had already been burned once by trusting the wrong family. Still, the land had its own way of drawing people close, and the more storms they weathered together, be it the howling winds that battered the cabin walls or the suspicious eyes of neighbors who whispered about the bald woman living under Elias's roof, the more Clara began to feel something she thought had been shaved away with her hair, a flicker of strength returning to her soul. The prairie had a way of testing a soul, and by the time the first snows of winter threatened the horizon, Clara had come to understand that her fight was no longer only against the memory of her shorn hair or the bitter laughter of her in-laws. It was against every shadow that dared to strip her of the life she was beginning to build. Elias had given her shelter, yes, but more than that, he had given her a place where her hands had purpose again, milking the cows at dawn, kneading bread in the old wooden kitchen, feeding chickens while the wind tangled the hem of her dress. Yet the whispers from town carried on the wind, reaching her ears like cruel echoes. The shamed widow, the bald stray the rancher took in. Worse still, her brother-in-law rode into town one evening, spreading rumors that she had stolen from the Weston family, claiming she was unfit, tainted, unworthy of pity. Clara had stood frozen in the mercantile when she heard it, her fingers trembling around a sack of flour. But before she could speak, Elias had stepped forward, his shadow tall and unyielding, his voice carrying the weight of a man who did not bend. "She is mine to protect," he'd said, and the whole store had gone silent. That night, under the stars, Clara had whispered through tears that she was nothing but a burden, that he deserved someone whole, and Elias had only shaken his head, his rough hand lifting her chin. "Don't you see, Clara? You're stronger than any of them, and you're not leaving my side, not now, not ever." His words had burned into her, not as a command but as a vow, and for the first time since her world had shattered, she felt the stirrings of a fire inside her, a fire that no blade could shave away, no cruel word could extinguish. Winter settled heavy on the prairie, the kind that buried fences in white and tested whether a family would see spring alive. Clara wrapped herself in Elias's old wool coat as she stood at the edge of the corral, her breath rising in clouds, her bald head hidden now beneath a knitted scarf she'd woven by hand. She had thought survival meant hiding, but now she knew survival meant standing, and tonight she would have to prove it. Word had spread that her in-laws, bitter and greedy for the land Elias owned, had struck a deal with men too mean to call themselves cowhands. They would come under cover of snow, take what they wanted, and leave ruin behind. Elias had sharpened his axe, checked the rifle twice, but when he looked at Clara, he didn't tell her to hide. Instead, he handed her the small revolver that had once belonged to his sister and said simply, "If they come, you stand with me." Her hands trembled as she took it, the cold metal heavy, the memory of her shame pressing down on her. But when Elias's eyes held hers, steady and certain, she felt the trembling still. That night, as the wind howled and the ranch lantern burned low, Clara sat beside him by the door, her heart thundering not from fear alone but from the realization that she was no longer the broken woman cast into the dirt. She was a fighter, a partner, a woman who had been told she was nothing, and yet had found a man who saw her as everything. And when the crunch of hooves broke the silence outside, Clara rose with Elias, her hand steady on the revolver, ready to defend the life and the love that was now hers to claim. The dawn after the attack came slow and pale, stretching across the snow like a promise that the land itself had chosen who would endure. Clara stood on the porch of Elias's ranch, the revolver still in her hand, her scarf slipping down to reveal the bare curve of her head that once symbolized only shame. But this morning, as the wind carried away the smoke of a night spent in gunfire and fear, she no longer felt the sting of humiliation. She had stood beside Elias, steady as the storm, her aim true when one of the hired men charged the fence, her voice unbroken when she shouted warnings into the night. And Elias, gritty, steadfast Elias, had looked at her not with pity, not even with pride alone, but with a kind of awe that made her heart tremble. They had defended the ranch together, driven back the men who came to tear their lives apart. And now, as the sun crested the horizon, Clara felt the weight of something new pressing down on her shoulders. Not grief, not shame, but the mantle of belonging. She had found her place not because Elias had said, "You're coming with me," but because she had chosen to stay, to fight, to claim her worth with her own two hands. The town would talk, the in-laws would stew in their bitterness, but Clara no longer bowed her head. She lifted her chin, the scar of her baldness now a crown, and whispered to the rising sun, "I am not broken. I am home." Behind her, Elias stepped onto the porch, his hand brushing hers, strong and certain, and for the first time, Clara smiled not with hope alone, but with the quiet certainty that their love would outlast the prairie winds. Spring came slow to the prairie, melting the snows into rivers that carved their way across the land. But in Clara's heart, the thaw had already begun. She no longer walked with her head down, no longer pulled her scarf tight to hide the truth of who she was. The stubble on her head had grown into a short, soft crown, but she wore it proudly, her bare scalp kissed by the sunlight as if to remind the world that she had survived. Elias watched her with the steady gaze of a man who had always seen her strength, but now he began to rely on it in ways he hadn't before. The ranch was growing, the cattle thriving, but with growth came challenges, neighbors disputing water rights, storms threatening the herd, whispers in town about a woman too bold for her place. Yet Clara no longer crumbled beneath whispers. She faced them head-on, her voice calm, her eyes fierce. One afternoon, when Elias stood before the town council arguing his claim to grazing land, Clara stepped forward beside him, her presence silencing the men who muttered under their breath, "This ranch is not his alone," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. "It is mine too. I have worked these fields, tended these cattle, stood guard at its gates. If you want to strip it from him, you will have to strip it from me." The room had gone still, and in that silence, Clara felt the weight of her old shame fall away for good. Later, as she and Elias rode home under the wide sky, he reached across to take her hand, his thumb brushing her knuckles in a silent vow. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "you don't just belong here. You are the reason this place will endure." And for the first time, Clara allowed herself to believe it fully, not as a gift from him, but as the truth she had carved with her own 2 hands. The summer sun burned high over the prairie, its heat heavy enough to crack the earth and test the patience of every rancher who called the land home. For Clara, the days had become a rhythm of labor and laughter, of long rides across the open range with Elias, of nights spent under the glow of lantern light where silence felt like a prayer, but peace was never a lasting gift on the frontier. Trouble had a way of finding its way across the horizon, and that trouble came in the form of men who were not Westons, nor neighbors, but strangers with eyes too sharp and smiles too cold. They came first as traders, offering deals that seemed too generous, asking too many questions about Elias's land and cattle. Clara's instincts, sharpened by hardship, stirred uneasily, but Elias dismissed them with a shake of his head. "We've dealt with worse," he said, his confidence steady. Yet weeks later, fences were cut, cattle driven off in the night, and one of the ranch hands returned bloodied from an ambush near the creek. Clara's blood ran hot with anger, the old fear that once silenced her now burning into something else entirely. She no longer trembled at shadows. She walked into town beside Elias, her bald head bare beneath the sun, and demanded answers from men who once sneered at her. And when those same strangers returned to the ranch one moonless night, torches in hand, Clara did not wait behind the door. She loaded Elias's rifle with steady hands, her heart hammering not with fear but with fire. She had been shamed, broken, and cast aside once, but never again. The prairie had taught her how to bend without breaking, and as the glow of flames touched the horizon, Clara knew this would be the battle that decided not only the ranch's survival, but her place as Elias's equal, bound not by pity, but by the kind of love that endured storms, fire, and the cruel judgment of the world. The night was alive with fire and fury. Clara stood at the edge of the barn, rifle in hand, her heart steady as the shadows of strange men danced in the torchlight across Elias's land. The air crackled with smoke, and the cries of cattle echoed through the valley as fences burned. Elias barked orders to the ranch hands, his voice sharp as steel, but when his eyes found Clara's, he didn't tell her to hide. He only nodded as if to say, "I trust you. I need you." And that trust carried her forward into the storm. She remembered the dirt under her knees the day her in-laws shaved her head, the laughter, the shame, the despair that had nearly swallowed her whole. That woman was gone. Tonight she was reborn in fire. She moved with purpose, her finger firm on the trigger, her voice calling out warnings to the men who dared lay claim to what was not theirs. When one torchbearer rushed toward the house, Clara stepped into his path, her bald head gleaming in the flames, her stance unshaken. "Not one step closer," she said, and the man faltered, as if the sheer force of her will struck him harder than any bullet could. Behind her, Elias fought like a man who had everything to lose and everything to live for, and together they drove the intruders back into the night. By dawn, the ranch still stood, scarred but unbroken, and Clara, covered in ash, her hands blistered, her breath ragged, felt something she had never known before: triumph. Not borrowed, not given, but earned with blood, fire, and unyielding defiance. As the first rays of sunlight touched the land, Elias wrapped his arm around her shoulders and whispered, "You've got more fight in you than anyone I've ever known, Clara May." She leaned into him, her rifle still in hand, and whispered back, "Because this time, I'm fighting for more than survival. I'm fighting for us."